Thank you, Jerry, and welcome to this evening. It promises to be quite auspicious, and we hope that there'll be a lot of interesting dialogue that will come out of the evening. As you can already read in the printed program, Rabbi Dov Marmur's memoir is titled 6 Lives. He was born in Poland and spent the years of World War II in the Soviet Union. The rabbi grew up in Sweden, where he attended school, and studied for the rabbinate in London at the Leo Baeck College. After serving 2 congregations with distinction in Britain, Rabbi Marmur immigrated with his wife Fredja to Canada, where from 1983 to the year 2000, he was the senior rabbi of Holy Blossom Temple in Toronto. Now, Holy Blossom, for those of you who need some identification, and my congregation, Beth Tzedec, are neighbors. They're the gray building, and we're the blonde. The Marmurs' love of Israel led them to also put down roots in the Holy Land, where he and Fredja are privileged to spend part of each year with their grandchildren. Israel became his 6th country and his 6th life. Now, he spells his name D-O-W, but it is pronounced Dov, the way a W would be pronounced in Europe. It's a Hebrew name, which means a bear. A bear, in the form of a plush animal, seems cute and cuddly. But in real life, as we know, bears are fast and fierce. Rabbi Marmur, cuddly would be too much. He is friendly. He has a fast intellect and a very quick wit. And he is a fierce critic of Jewish life, of Canadian and Israeli society, and of what he sees as social or spiritual falsehood. He brings a prophetic voice to his pulpit and to his writings. Rabbi Marmur has a wicked sense of humor. And in fact, when he spoke here many years before for our Interfaith gathering, he spoke on a serious look at Jewish humor. He has a bee-like ability to notice and fly right into the center of a flower or an issue. He has a European sensibility, full of skepticism, irony, and at times futility. Despite all of this, Rabbi Marmur is a genuinely warm person who occasionally surprises me with an optimistic insight. Now, Rabbi Marmur is the Rabbi Emeritus of Holy Blossom, as well as a regular columnist in the Canadian Jewish News and the Toronto Star. He often blogs from Jerusalem, from which he has only just returned. As I indicated, he last spoke at this Interfaith gathering. I thought it was 1987. I've now been corrected. It was 1989. He has an additional 23 years of wisdom to share with us tonight. Rabbi Marmur.
I asked your chair how long I should speak. So he said, well, whatever you think is right, which reminded me of a story or a scene by 2 Yiddish-speaking comedians in Israel, Jigan and Schumacher, old generation. One of them has a plumbing problem. So the plumber comes in and deals with it, and then the owner of the apartment says, "How much do I owe you?" And the plumber says, "Whatever you think is proper." "No," says the man, "that's too much." So when your chairman said to me, well, whatever you think is fit, my temptation was to say, no, that's too much. So we'll keep it reasonably brief. The Hebrew for truth is emet, a word that has significance in Jewish tradition because its three radicals are the first, the middle, and the last letter of the alphabet. And there is a tradition that says that God's seal is truth. The trouble is that we humans can't really get to all of it. If we are privileged, if we are lucky, we get fragments of it. Fragments that we now believe evolve through history, change, are modified, and some of us are even prepared to describe revelation in those terms as an ongoing process of encounter between humans and God. But it will always be partial, insufficient. You know the old Oriental story about a group of blind people being sent out to describe an elephant. And one said, an elephant is like a trunk, because they held on to its leg. And so it went on. Different people described different parts of the elephant, but nobody could really describe it in full. And that's a kind of metaphor for what's happening to us. That's why most religious people, in order to make a point, quote others, those who have preceded them. You look around here, you already heard about the quotation over the ark. The ark itself is in the shape of a page in the Talmud. And if you go on, you will find many other such quotes. I just see something else there. Because our language is insufficient. We cannot express it all, so we go back to our forebears and hope to find some kind of image that will describe it. So, as it is written, is an important part of the religious discourse. Now, many people find that exceedingly unsatisfactory. They want certainty. They want to feel that everything there is to be said and felt and experienced is in their hands. I don't think they mind being called fundamentalists. That is to say, they affirm the fundamentals, they stick to them. They would say that revelation happened once and for all, and that all we have to do is to go back and discover it and formulate it. Anything else would be impossible. Scripture, and I think that there's actually a book called Fundamentalism that identifies Scripture as being inerrant, not in error. So that's the other view. And religious life is in constant tension, never mind Jews, Christians, or whoever, between these two ways of looking at things. And we are inconsistent, and we are self-contradictory at times, but that's where it is. Strangely enough, many non-religious people, when faced with a choice, prefer certainty to truth. In a column I just wrote for the Star, I suggested that atheists today tend to be more rigid and fundamentalist than the religionists I know, many of the religionists I know. I've, needless to say, had a flood of responses, all of them proving my point. Interfaith is by its very nature a liberal pursuit. We have to accept that. Namely, we are the people who say, hey, I don't have the whole truth. And perhaps if I speak to you and I learn from you, I'll get a little more of it. And you feel the same way about me, so we share and we experience and we expand our views. One of the remarkable things about interfaith altogether is that those who engage in it almost invariably learn more, are more committed to their own faith and their own tradition. It's not that it's watered down, but on the contrary, by learning from each other, our commitments grow. So what we are trying to do, and I've been involved in this work for a long time, is to affirm, not to deny, to respect, not to attack. The moment you recognize that I don't have the whole truth, and that I am anxious to find out what yours is, I cannot be consistent and invalidate your stance. I have to listen. I have to learn. This by way of an introduction. Now, the way we learn very often is that we say what Christians and Jews have in common is what Jews call the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and what some Christians, less so in nowadays, mercifully call the Old Testament. Hebrew Scriptures is a much more common term nowadays. That's what we have in common, but we don't read it the same way, because you cannot read Scripture without having spectacles. And there are Jewish spectacles, and there are Christian spectacles. And what is fascinating is that by listening to each other, we may get new insights into our own. Not always, not consistently, but sometimes. What normally divides us when it comes to this scripture quoting is, of course, what Christians call the New Testament and what Jews see as rabbinic literature. Two different ways of taking Scripture, the Hebrew Bible, forward. Again, there are similarities, connections, differences. One way of, there is a mechanism in Jewish tradition called midrash, exegesis, interpretation, which involves much, much more than just interpreting. And perhaps there is a way of saying that these two different ways are two different versions of that midrash. But I would like to draw your attention today to a book which I brought here. It's called The Jewish Annotated New Testament. It's not the first and it's not the only book that Jews have written about the New Testament, but it's perhaps the most comprehensive and the most fascinating. It's been edited by two Jewish scholars, and it has contribution from many more. It is a way of making that particular connection more solid, more meaningful, more significant. It's based, and the editors quoted in the preface, or influenced by a Swedish theologian. Who else? Who in fact was the dean of Harvard Divinity School, apart from being Bishop of Stockholm, the late Christer Stendahl. Very important figure in this work. And incidentally, the University of Lund in southern Sweden, most countries have two universities, Harvard and Yale, Oxford and Cambridge. Sweden has Uppsala and Lund. They've just inaugurated a chair, the Christer Stendahl Chair, which, believe it or not, the holder spends part of the time in Sweden and part of the time in Jerusalem. That kind of. Now, Stendahl was very much involved in interfaith activities and formulated a 3-point program, which I would like to quote to you, because it enables us to read each other's scriptures or read our own scriptures in that particular light. He says, number 1, when you are trying to understand another religion, you should ask the adherents of that religion, not its enemies. If you want to know, as Christians, what Judaism says, ask a Jew, not someone who doesn't like Judaism, and vice versa. What we often tend to do is that we ignore that particular rule. And one of my great joys and privileges has been that for many years I taught a course at St. Michael's College on contemporary Jewish thought. Now, Stendahl's second point is, don't compare your best to their worst. Tempting, isn't it? We always find something that we don't like in the other and something we very much like in our own, and we then make an equivalence. Don't do it, says Stendahl. Number 3, leave room for what he calls holy envy. That's quoted here. Stendahl meant by that the ability to recognize in the other religious traditions or faith that you admire and wish that could in some way be reflected in your own religious tradition of faith. You're allowed to be envious of the other. It's holy envy, says Stendahl, and say, I wish my religious community or my religious tradition did whatever. And this is not the time for confession, but I have a long list of things as a Jew that I am sort of envious, wholly envious, of course, in my connection with contacts with Christians and Christianity. And I would like to think it works the other way around too. So that's the foundation of this particular book. And with it, a new dimension of interfaith work has been opened. Now, all this is anathema to what I would call the certainty mongers. They don't like that at all. And I could, of course, disregard the 3 principles I've just read and now illustrated by examples from other religions. But that's not my aim. Let me stay with my own. We have plenty of certainty mongers in our own Jewish circles. Rabbi Friedman Cole mentioned that I spend almost half the year, not quite, in Jerusalem nowadays. We're part of my family, one of my children and my son, and his wife and their children, now grown up, live. And there, and living in Jerusalem, you do encounter Jewish certainty mongers everywhere. They know exactly that they are right, and they know even more precisely that you are wrong. One of the things, for example, that young women are subjected to. Let me go back. My son had a special birthday over Passover, and before lunch, they decided to have a treasure hunt on the new light railway in Jerusalem, different stops. Guests went along, and so members of the family stood at certain stations to deal with that. My youngest 18-year-old granddaughter was placed, if you know Jerusalem, near the Museum of the Sea, which is the border, what used to be the border between East and West Jerusalem before 1967. It's very close to the ultra-Orthodox district. The abuse that girl got, verbal, mercifully only, from 10, 12-year-olds who are programmed as soon as they see someone in a skirt that's a bit shorter, yes, that's obviously a sign that the girl is a prostitute. And they use that word freely as an illustration. Now, these kids, from the very outset, are taught exactly who is right and who is wrong, who is in and who is out, and so it goes on. Now, the irony here is worth noting, and let that be an example of, I won't do many more of those. The irony is this, that if you ask these people, why do you behave like this? They will say, because I want to preserve Jewish tradition, etc., etc., etc. In fact, when you look at it, you find that they imitate others. Even their garb is the garb of East European non-Jews, probably Sunday best. Probably. But also the mentality. Why is this movement so strong today, much stronger than it was? Much stronger than it was in relative terms, in absolute terms, when the Jewish state was established 64 years ago. Because that's what's happening in the Christian world and in the Muslim world too. There is that kind of fundamental. So while you are saying that you want to be as different as possible from them, you end up being very much like them. Second point, if you look at the sources of Judaism on which this stance is based, you will find that it's never that rigid. Neither the Bible, nor rabbinic literature, nor Jewish law has that kind of rigidity. Although some like to present it like this. So it's a misconstruction, ostensibly out of piety. The third piece of irony is that the irreligious tend to support fundamentalists much more than liberals. Because liberals are sort of close, you have to relate. But and that's very true in Israel, where there is a kind of unspoken collusion often between many secularists who say the only authentic religion is the extreme one, and that's why I don't want it. You see, with people like the rabbis you come across here, non-religious people have to relate, have to deal with it. You know, they read the same books, they speak the same language, and you have to somehow take a stand. And that's true again in Christianity as much as in Judaism. There you don't have to do it. And so you have a very unholy alliance between the secular and the extremists. I'm speaking about Judaism. I could speak similarly of other religion. And the way secularists often try to explain it is in a kind of mysticism. You may have noticed that in contemporary religious life, at the time, you know, with all the science and technology growing, mysticism, again, in Judaism and in other religions, has become strong. Which, the definition which I saw recently, which I liked, is that mysticism is to act with certainty and be uncertain of the truth of the very act. Act with certainty and be uncertain of the truth. See, by the time you say it's mystical, you don't have to explain, you don't have to give any rational reason, you know, it just happens like that. And needless to say that that kind of approach opens itself out to extremism. And there's plenty of it around in the religions that we're involved. That has made me, and that's very unpopular, I want you to know, very wary of spirituality. I am for holiness, for the sacred. Because what worries me about spirituality is that there's no rational framework for it. That is how you feel. That it's much more, God is within me, and the problem with God being within me is that me becomes God. And again, looking at where we are in this world today, we have to recognize that that's popular and that is doing well. And the same people look down on people like me because we, by the very nature of the fact that we know we don't have the whole truth, and so we have to examine, we have to scrutinize ourselves, we have to agonize, we are never quite sure. As a liberal, I want to learn from everybody, even with those who disagree with me. And that includes fundamentalist Jews, evangelical Christians, the defenders of Sharia and Islam, and so forth. What worries me and what inhibits me is if the same people for whom I try to understand and learn want to chop my head off. It's a huge problem. One of the things that I resent very much is I'm forced to act illiberally, to defend myself, to protect myself. And, I'm part of the reform movement in Israel, which not doing very well because of all these things. And so, we are involved in all kinds of defensive actions. I live in Jerusalem, and much of that is played out in the Holy City. Jews, Christians, Muslims, on many a street corner. For example, that it's now a recognized clinical condition called the Jerusalem syndrome. People who come to Jerusalem on a shorter visit or longer visit and believe or say they believe that they are the Redeemer. Of any guy, you walk the city and you find someone who has dressed like that and presents himself like that. And the climate, the interesting thing is that this is 21st century, encourages this. And I am pretty sure that if I did something similar, I'd have much better congregations than I've ever had. They're trying to argue like I do now. Well, they call it wishy-washy. Man of little faith, uncertain doctrine, and so forth. That's the condition in which we find ourselves. That's the constant tension between what I've called truth and certainty that we experience. And that's also why interfaith work on every possible level is so important. We are the witnesses. And though we will never be the majority, always somewhat on the margin, you who know the origins of your faith and I who know the origins of mine, know that being on the margin has always been the characteristic of those who have shaped our faith. And so we shouldn't be demoralized by it. But we have a new problem in our time. When we speak of interfaith, it's Christians and Jews. Perhaps that's possible in this part of Toronto. It's not possible in most European cities. And it's not possible in Israel. Muslims have to be included. How do we do that? Very hard, very difficult, for reasons which we can't go into here. But if we're true to interfaith, we have to find a way of doing it. There is an organization in the world called the International Council of Christians and Jews. Its current president is someone I know very well, a Jerusalem resident called Dr. Debbie Wiseman. She's just been in Australia. And in the report I just saw, she says, what Christians and Jews have achieved together is tremendous. But in order to be really consistent with what we are about, we have to find ways of including Muslims. I see that as a challenge on every level, and I would like to leave you with that particular thought. And thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I did speak once before in this forum on Jewish humor, and the reason at the time was that I'd been to a previous meeting where someone stood there and wagged his finger at us. So I thought I couldn't take that kind of serious business anymore. But I've come back to redeem myself and be a bit more serious tonight. Thank you very much.